Hello, everyone. In this lecture, I want to cover the war to end all wars, right? So today we're going to talk about the Great War, right? So I always find it very fascinating that most people are very knowledgeable, or at least off the top of their head, they know quite a little bit of things about the Second World War, but most people don't know much about World War One, besides, trench warfare is what most people know a little bit about. To give you an example, just stop and think about it right now. How much do you know about World War One versus World War Two? It's much more likely that you know quite a bit more about World War Two than World War One, right? So, the Great War, as it's commonly known, it's very interesting, it's fascinating, and I always find that explaining the reasons behind World War One are a little bit more complicated than the reasons for World War Two, right? So in this video, I want to take that opportunity. Okay, so let's get started. All right. So I usually make the argument that World War One was kind of sort of inevitable, right? If you pay attention to the economic, political, social, military circumstances of the time, you can tell that there are hints that a conflict is going to happen, right? We just no one could have anticipated how big it was going to become, all right? But all the circumstances for conflict are there. Uh, One of the main things that is also going to precipitate the war and make it happen possibly sooner than it should have happened is the Industrial Revolution. Another reason why I think the Industrial Revolution is so important, all right? If you think about it, just like we talked about all the luxuries being transformed into necessities and all of those mass production that I talked about during the Revolution, uh, you can also start mass producing weapons, right? So it's not just guns, but also, eventually tanks, airplanes, machine guns, all the weapons of war can now be mass produced too, right? So this is just going to accelerate all this conflict that we're brewing in Central Europe, and it's going to cause the war to happen sooner than it should have. All right. So when we talk about the Great War, we usually need to divide it between two things, right? One of them is what is called the spark that causes the war, and then the underlying causes of the war, right? So if you want to talk about the spark that causes the war, it is the assassination of the Archduke of Austria-Hungary. His name is Franz Ferdinand, right? So he's the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he's going to be assassinated by a member of a terrorist organization called the Black Hand, right? So, uh, what is going to happen is that Austria-Hungary believes that the Serbian government is behind the assassination, right? So, it's going to give them a deadline, kind of sort of an ultimatum, to allow Austria-Hungary to conduct an independent organization inside of Serbia to determine, what happened, right? When Serbia refused to do this, this is when Austria-Hungary declared war, and from here, a series of events, are going to escalate, kind of like a domino effect, and is going to cause the war to escalate and develop into what we know as World War One. Okay, so this is a very long story short of how it develops. Now, if you stop and think about it, the entirety of the Great War, with all those millions of casualties, did not happen because, Gavrilo Princip, the member of the Black Hand, assassinated Franz Ferdinand, right? The real reason is more complicated, all right? So we usually divide them into four different categories, right? And to simplify them, we call them with the acronym of MAIN, right? Militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism, right? So let me break it down. Okay. So first of all, militarism, right? This is what I meant by the Industrial Revolution, causing this arms race, right? Because during this time, there had already been previous conflict between European nations. And, once they're able to mass produce weapons, everyone starts, building up their arsenal. And just think about it like this. If my enemy has this amount of weapons, I need to have this amount of weapons. I need to have double. And once they come up to my terms, I need to double them and so on and so forth, right? So it's gonna create this arms race of militarism, of weapons, and it's gonna create this environment where people are kind of sort of ready for war, right? They're kind of like expecting a war to happen, right? So that is the idea of militarism, okay? And it's very directly linked to the Industrial Revolution, okay? So the second cause is alliances. And for this, there's a great political cartoon that explains, right? So let me show it to you.
All right, so this is a political cartoon that illustrates the idea of alliances during World War One. Okay, so what you see here, this smaller gentleman here, this represents Serbia. Okay, so Serbia is being threatened by Austria-Hungary. Okay, which is represented by the second gentleman here. Okay, so the way to think about it is think that Serbia has a bigger cousin, and that bigger cousin is Russia, which is represented by the third gentleman here, right? So Austria Hungary also has a cousin, right? And that is Germany, who's going to interfere in his behalf, right? So far you have Serbia here and Russia on one side versus Austria Hungary and Germany on the other side. And think about it like this: Russia also has another cousin, okay? And that cousin is France, okay? Which you can see him here, right? And then the other gentleman here represents Britain, that is going to join the war eventually. So this idea of alliances, these nations are bound by their alliances to, act on behalf of their allies. Okay, so it's not so much that these people care so deeply about guerrilla friendship. It has to do a lot with the idea of alliances. And so eventually, what you're going to see is Austria Hungary, the German Empire, and eventually the Ottoman Empire on one side called the Central Powers. And then on the other side, you're going to see the Russian Empire, France, and Britain. And if you're wondering where is the United States in all of this, we are not part of it. We will join the war until 1917, all right? And we will join the war on the side of the British and the French. By that time, the Russians had abandoned the war. And so this map is going to show us the next point, which is imperialism, right? So this is one of the driving factors because if you think about it, it is not that all these nations are willing to go to war and sacrifice millions of people because Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, right? It is mostly the idea of imperialism. This is a great opportunity for them to expand their empires, right? So I want you to pay attention to, for example, France, all right, here in pink. So this is France, and these are some of the colonies that France had in Africa, some of the colonies that France had in Asia. All right. You can also look at Germany. All right. And Germany is in orange. Okay. So these are some of the colonies that Germany had in Africa. All right. And some of them in Asia. Now you also need to pay attention to the British. Here in green are the British. And the British have colonies all throughout Africa, all throughout Asia. So the point I'm trying to make is that this is a great example of these people looking for a way to continue expanding their empires. And if you think about it, this is one of the main reasons for World War One.
And so, if you think about it, this is also, if you know a little bit of American history in the early 1900s or late 1800s, this is also one of the reasons why the US starts expanding, right? After kind of like Manifest Destiny is completed, now we have this idea of the American imperialism, right? And it's basically this idea of like we've already conquered everything, from coast to coast, the way that Manifest Destiny called for, but now we need, where else can we go, right? And if you wanted to be a competing nation around the world, you had to do what the other nations were doing. So if you were paying attention, the leading nations, Germany, France, England, everyone has colonies. And that is how they're maintaining, or that is how they're expanding their empires. And that is how they're keeping up on top. All right. So if the US wanted to be a competing nation against these leading nations, we had to kind of like play by the same playbook, right? There are other undertones, in the idea of the justifications for, the white man version, for example, that basically said that we're doing them a favor, we're bringing better culture, we're bringing better economies, we're bringing democracy, all those different things, right? So, you know, all these things are true, and if you think about it, this is one of the main motivators for World War I, right? Because this is what I meant by, if you looked at the early 1900s and early 1800s, all the circumstances for war are there. All these leading nations are competing against each other for acquiring these territories. They're justifying it as this idea of, you know, everything that I just mentioned earlier, right? But the reality is that this is the steps that they need to take if they want to stay on top, right? So this is why uh, imperialism is such a great cause for World War I, right? Now, the other last cause is the idea of nationalism. Okay, so during this time, there's a strong sense of nationalism. Now, the best way to understand nationalism is to compare it against patriotism, right? So, what is the difference between patriotism and nationalism? Well, patriotism means basically, I love my country. Nationalism goes a step further and says, I love my country and I believe mine is better than yours. You know, for no particular reason, maybe it's true, maybe it's not, but you believe your country is better culturally, economically, politically, everything, right? You have a sense of superiority. Sometimes it's racial, and sometimes it's cultural, right? But the idea is that you believe your country is better, right? And this is something that happens a lot during World War I. These nations truly believe they are culturally superior or racially superior to the other nations, right? And they have a sense of, we are justified in expanding because we're bringing better culture, right? We are, better than them. So why not? And so this is how the war ends up escalating. The spark through the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, and then all this underlying causes, and then eventually this is going to escalate into a full-on 4-year war that is going to lead about 20 million people dead, plus other 20 million casualties, wounded and things like that, right? So it is one of the biggest events in the history of the world. It is also considered one of the first modern wars because not only do you have the photograph, but also you have video. This is one of the things that I always find very interesting, right? We have real video of the 1914 through 1918 of this horrible circumstances that is happening, all right? And because the technology is so new, this the tactics of war are not fully developed, right? Most people still have these ideas of the wars as they were being fought before the Industrial Revolution, not a war for tanks and airplanes and poison gas and machine guns and submarines and all these new technologies of war. So the war will be cruel, it will be brutal in a way that no one can imagine, all right? And one of the ways that I also like to think about it is, how much the Industrial Revolution changed this, right? The technology of the time, right? Because just about 50 years earlier, you had the Civil War. And, the most advanced technology in the war during the Civil War is basically, for example, the repeating rifle, some cannons, and that was about the technology of the time, all right? But when you go 50 years in the future, you see a war with technological advancement that are unimaginable. Okay, airplanes, tanks, everything that I just mentioned earlier, right? Right. So technology drastically changed how the war was fought, and this is why most people consider like this is the first true modern war, in the sense that technology, you know, just revolutionizes the way war is being fought. And also on top of that, you need to think that this is a war of families, right? So this is a fun fact of World War I that it's very well documented and most people know it, but let me just show it to you. Okay.
All right, so these are the main players of World War One. You have Kaiser Wilhelm II, the German emperor, King George V, the King of England, and Tsar Nicholas II, the Emperor of Russia. Right. So if you haven't noticed, King George V and Tsar Nicholas II look almost identical, and this is because they're cousins. Okay, so they're not the only two cousins, but Kaiser Wilhelm II is also cousin with them, right? So all three of them are not on the same side, right? So George V and Nicholas II are on one side, and they're all fighting their first cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II, right? When I say they're cousins, I don't mean to say distant cousins. I mean to say they're literally first cousins who grew up together. Uh, in particular, George V and Nicholas II, their mothers were sisters. They grew up together. They're all grandchildren of Queen Victoria. And, in a way, this is a huge family war. All right. On one side, you have the two cousins who are almost like brothers. On the other side is Wilhelm II, who was always like the guy who could never get along with the other side of the family. And especially if you know the tragic end of what's gonna happen to Tsar Nicholas the second and his family, all the Romanov family, this makes it all the more tragic, right? Especially knowing that his cousin George, kind of sort of didn't save him when he had the opportunity to save him, right? But there's a lot of very interesting things coming out of the Great War, and this is one of the ones that I always thought was very very interesting.
All right. So as a final thought, just see World War One as this is part one of a much bigger conflict that will develop 20 years later, right? The way I like to understand it is that the only way to truly, fully understand World War Two, you need to understand World War One, right? Especially the latter part of World War One, right? The end of the First World War is going to usher World War Two, right? So the only way to understand the circumstances that led to the Second World War is to understand the circumstances that led to the conclusion of World War One. Okay, so anyways, I don't want to take too much of your time. This is all I have for you today. I'll see you guys around. Okay, be safe.